It's 7 o'clock, so let's get started. So welcome to the first Sperry Galigar Audubon Society meeting of the year. It's been a long stretch with no meeting. We didn't have met since the first week of December. If this is your first time, we meet the last Thursday of the month during the academic year. So the last Thursday of every month from now until May, and then May is our picnic, end of the year picnic. So we're glad you're here. We have excellent guest speakers every month, and take this chance to remind you that everybody's welcome. We're so glad you're here, but we are a membership organization. You can join the Sperry Galigar Audubon Society for $20. So come see us. You can pay by check, PayPal, or probably no. I suppose you can pay with cash or something too. Any other announcements? Anything else that we need to share for any over to our guest speaker? I don't think so. So our guest speaker is going to introduce herself.
All right. As soon as I can manage the microphone. All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep. All right. And let's see, is this about the right light level? Yeah, all right.
You've done this before.
Yeah, the whole projector it's different than when I taught up here. So, okay, well, good evening, everybody. My name is Dalia Lister. I am, and most of you probably know me, but I am the director of Nature Reach at Pittsburgh State University, and I also teach in the biology department here. And I was trying to do the math, and I think I'm almost at my 20th year as the director of Nature Reach, which is kind of hard to believe, right? But my journey at Pitt State started sooner than that, because I, in 1999, started as an undergraduate and got my bachelor's in biology education, got my master's under the Cindy Ford. And recently I finished my PhD in education at the University of Missouri St. Louis, so just completely finished, yes. in August. So this evening I'm going to talk about just a small portion of what I did for my doctoral research. So there's many more things that I did, but I wanted to sort of hone in on this one particular part of it. And I guess first question, how many of you have been to Joshua Tree? So a few, right? How about Glacier Bay? Probably not as many. Yeah, nice. So the title of my talk is Bridging Science and Story, Communicating Climate Change in 2 Iconic National Parks. And both of those parks, I think most of us would agree, are iconic, and their namesakes are in jeopardy because of climate change. And I want to point out before I go too far, who's the one doing the bridging of the science and story? And we have to remember that not all scientists are great communicators. They might be great communicators with each other, which is absolutely necessary, but not necessarily to the general public. And there are professionals that do this, right? So they're called heritage interpreters. And they take that really complex science information and make it more digestible and relevant and personal to the general public. Some of my interp kids are in here, and so this should be sounding somewhat familiar to you, right, at this point, right? Now, most of us may not know what heritage interpretation is, but you might have been to a ranger talk, and you see the green and gray and the flat top hat, and you go and you sit through a program, those are interpreters, right? Interpretive rangers. There's lots of different kinds of park rangers, but those are interpretive rangers. Now, they're not just in national parks, they're also in state parks. Anybody recognize that dude? So yeah, it's Chris Pistol. He was one of the first directors of Nature Reach after Cindy. And so yeah, they're at state parks. And then of course, that young pup up there, who actually did introduce me to the field of interpretation. So here I am today. But So tonight, we're going to talk about a little bit of my research in Joshua Tree and Glacier Bay with my team. Then we'll talk about why climate change is sometimes called the perfect problem. And then I'll give you just a few of the key recommendations that we gave our National Park Service partners. And these were ultimately co-created with them because we did all the research and then we took the research to them and said, okay, what's gonna work best for your particular park? Okay, so to make sure we're all on the same page here, we're gonna start off very basically. So the greenhouse effect, I'm sure most of you have heard of, right? And it's absolutely necessary for life to exist on Earth. So we have the Earth, and we have the sun, and we have solar radiation hitting the Earth. But we have this layer of greenhouse gases that acts like a blanket. And so that helps keep us warm enough to sustain life. The problem comes when we put too much greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, and excuse me, through the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. And so that causes the globe to warm, and climate change. And I think the last time I looked, we were at something like 1.35 degrees Celsius warmer than we should be. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, right? But let me put it to you in another way. So it's roughly the amount of excess energy that we're putting into the Earth's atmosphere, 400,000 atomic bombs per day, 365 days a year. That's a substantial amount. Okay, and we're talking the atomic bombs that we dropped on Japan, right? And of course, the ramifications of that are numerous. I'm not going to list all of them, but of course, more severe weather, bigger floods, bigger droughts, all kinds of human health issues that we don't necessarily connect to climate change, but are a result, indirectly or directly, of climate change. Now, I knew going into my doctoral program that I wanted to study climate change, and I was really hoping I could get to spend some time in the national parks. And one of the reasons, multiple reasons up there, the National Park Service has 433 park units, 63 of which have been designated by Congress as national parks. And the last year annual visitation was about 300 million or 330 million visitors. So that's a potential for a huge audience to reach, probably bigger than any place else you're going to get overall. I would consider national parks critical classrooms. I think the best learning happens outside the four walls of a classroom. And so if you can learn about not only the natural resources, but the cultural resources, that will give you a better picture of the whole of a place. And believe it or not, in the government, there are still trusted agencies. Probably one of the only one is the National Park Service. And I will talk about that here in a little bit. And unfortunately, our national parks are warming at twice the rate of other parts of the United States. And in part because they're already in sensitive areas, like the desert Southwest, like Alaska. And the other thing I want to point out here is that the National Park Service has a mission and a mandate that they follow the highest quality science. In every decision that they make, in every education program they do, that is what they are supposed to follow. Now, I was really hoping, like I said, to be able to work in the parks, and it's not always easy to get a park permit to work in one of these big national parks. But I was very lucky because not only did I have my major professor was heavily connected to the parks, but does anybody recognize this guy? I wouldn't be surprised if nobody did. So this guy is the Honorable Bob Stanton. He was the first African-American director of the National Park Service, and he was appointed under President Clinton. So I had an in, let's just say, to the parks. Okay, so like I said, I was on a team of researchers. There were 4 of us, and we all had a strong interest in national parks. And we all cared deeply about climate change. And so we want to know, okay, how is climate change affecting specific parks? What were the parks doing to communicate to audiences about climate change, if anything? And then a lot of what we did was interview lots of people. So we wanted to know what park visitors, the staff, the subject matter experts, and any stakeholders that we could find, what did they understand about climate change? And then ultimately, what recommendations could we give to help the parks maybe better interpret climate change? Okay, so our whirlwind trip was a total of 2 weeks. We spent a week in Joshua Tree and a week in Glacier Bay National Park. And we chose the hottest week of the hottest year on record. Didn't know that what we were going into, but we went in July. So that's when we could all travel. We're all educators, but it just so happened that we were there at the hottest week of the hottest year on record. And there were people that died in or near the park that summer for sure. And they weren't kidding when they put up signs that said, "Don't die today." Did anybody remember seeing those? Like if you visited the park? Yeah, they're all over the place and they really mean it. Okay, so Joshua trees, if you don't know, Joshua trees were named after, in 1850s, the Mormons were traveling through and they thought it looked like a big biblical figure, Joshua, reaching his arms up to the heavens, I suppose. And they're an indicator of the Mojave Desert. So you kind of know you're in the Mojave Desert if you see Joshua trees. And the other thing that I'll try to point out here is that they're a keystone species. So they're incredibly important to the desert ecosystem. They are responsible for helping take care of a lot of other critters and plants in that desert ecosystem. And if you're not familiar exactly with where it is, so you've got Los Angeles here, and that's going to be important here in a minute, of course, and then Joshua Tree is over here. And it's a park where literally two deserts meet. So this is sort of an arbitrary little line I put in there. But the idea is that the Mojave Desert is a little bit higher in elevation. It's cooler, it's wetter, and that's where you're going to find the Joshua trees. If you're in Colorado, which is sort of a subdivision of the Sonoran Desert, it's lower elevation, it's hotter and drier, and you're going to find plants like the cholla cactus, like ocotillo. You guys remember seeing those if you were in the desert? Yeah, they're beautiful plants. And the park itself is mostly a driving park. I mean, there's plenty of other things to do, but you can drive through it easily. Los Angeles is not that far, so this park gets somewhere in the neighborhood of like 3 million people. And the park was actually built for about 1 million people to visit every year. So they're having a lot of trouble with how they handle crowds and where they put them all when they come into a visitor center, that sort of thing. And again, if you've been to the park, you might have seen just randomly, it seems like these big piles of boulders that just look like a bulldozer just dropped a bunch of rocks in the middle of the desert. There's some really cool geology with that. I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but very interesting part of the park. Okay, now I'm going to ask you guys a question. Why do places and stories matter?
Because they are how humans relate to the world and each other.
Okay. What else?
What you remember.
It's what you remember?
What I remember after I leave is the stories.
Yep. So stories, and especially if it's even more important if they're really personal stories, help you place a value, or help you put a value on a place, I guess I should say. And yeah, once we are at a place, we see how important it is, how we have a connection to that place, then of course we're going to want to preserve it and take care of it and do what we can to make sure that those places and spaces continue to exist. So in Joshua Tree, you might be somebody that really loves to go look for birds and herps and whatever else that you might find, and the desert itself is very deceptive. Many people will look at a desert and see, it's just this dry place. When actually, there's some amazing plants and amazing animals that are well adapted to the desert environment. Now, you might come to the park to go rock climbing. Has anybody done that, rock climbing in Joshua Tree? Yeah, it's pretty cool. And then, of course, the Park Service does do a ton of research, both cultural and natural, in the park. And then the night skies in Joshua Tree are quite stunning. So, in fact, many people go to the park just for the night skies. Now, culturally, there were several different indigenous tribes that lived in what we know now as Joshua Tree National Park. So the Chemehueve, the Serrano, the Kalahuya, I probably butchered the name, I think Pinto. So several different tribes lived and thrived, and that's their ancestral homeland. And so they really have a really tight connection to that place. Now that's probably a very different view if you were somebody that's into the Old West and gold mining, that sort of thing. But I want to take a minute and talk about this woman right here. And does anybody happen to know who she is? So this is a woman named Minerva Hamilton Hoyt. And just like many women across the country, if it weren't for the work that they did, some of our national parks wouldn't exist. And so she was the main driver, I would say, behind preserving Joshua Tree. So around, I want to say it was something like 1918. Her husband had died, and she was looking for solace in the desert and saw the beauty of the desert, but also saw all the destruction that was happening to the desert. And so she decided that she would start traveling around and exhibiting different desert plants and such. And she even got an audience, probably much easier to do this back then, got an audience with FDR, with the president. And she convinced him to designate Joshua Tree as a national monument. And if you're not sure with how this works, so presidents can designate national monuments, Congress has to designate national parks. So of course, the place of Joshua Tree was very, very important to her. Okay, who knows U2? Yeah, you might have the album. It is called The Joshua Tree. So probably one of their most famous albums they recorded. They had really amazing experiences in the park. And so the song With or Without You, I'm sure I can't even think of the other ones right now. But very popular album. And I'd be really curious to know if anybody knows who this guy is. Graham Parsons. Do you know the story? A little bit? Yeah. So there's a few different versions, but and I'll try to keep it more of the PG version. So Graham Parsons and his friends and his manager were partying one night outside the park, and unfortunately, Graham Parsons overdosed and passed away. And his manager knew that he wanted his remains to go to the park. And after he'd passed away, they took his body to LAX, the Los Angeles airport, to be taken home. But his manager and his friends had other ideas. So they hijacked his body with a hearse and drove him as far as they could, and probably they were a bit intoxicated when they were doing this. And they took him as far as they could, which happened to be this place called Cap Rock. They tried to pull him out of the hearse, and things kind of went south from there. So he sort of fell out. They wanted to burn him. They thought it would be easy to cremate him at the park. And so they doused him with gasoline and lit him on fire, and he did not burn completely. So eventually, of course, people saw the fire and they were caught, and they ultimately brought him home. Now, why would I tell that story? Well, this has become quite the cult story, cult classic. There's some, like I said, different versions of this story out there. And now every year they have Grand Fest in the park. And the folks that are into music, they may not value the park the way that I do, but they certainly have high value on the park, and they want to maintain the park and not see it be degraded. Okay, so what did we do? So I'm a biologist by training, but I had to learn social science research, which was a little bit difficult at first for me to do. And I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details, but we went to every place we could from sunup to sundown, and we studied what people were looking at, how they were interacting with exhibits, We interviewed, I think in all, did something like 70 different interviews, and they weren't short interviews. Well, I take that back. With visitors, they were fairly short. But this is Cap Rock, by the way. This is where Graham was taken. But they had all kinds of interpretive programs in the evenings, for example. This was one of the park rangers that did an interpretive talk at the sunset stroll. And then we grabbed some visitors at the end and had to do some interviews with them. Now, I will say, the field research gets pretty rough sometimes. We had to take a few selfies and act like tourists ourselves. But we actually did glean quite a bit of information from just walking through the park, going where the people were, doing all the interviews of all of the folks that I mentioned there. Okay, and how is climate change affecting the park? Now, the list is long, but I'm going to mention two things here. So, first, this is I believe Key's view, and can you see kind of the haziness and the smogginess, right? So, all of the pollution from Los Angeles is getting pushed to the park, and unfortunately, it's causing several problems. It's damaging the plants, but it's also creating essentially a fertilizer for invasive grasses. And then those invasive grasses catch fire, and the fire burns through the park faster than it ever would have if they weren't there. And so this, you might have heard about this on the news. This was called the SEMA Dome fire in, I think it was 2020, something like that. It wasn't in the park, but it was outside the park, and probably, I want to say it was something like 20,000 or 40,000 acres were burned. Okay, now I will give a shout out to one of my research teammates. She's a physicist who taught in Boston area. And so she took some modeling research that was done by University of California, Riverside. She said, okay, this is where we are right now. We are at 65,000, 22 hectares of Joshua trees. If we do something and we sort of curb our appetite and the amount of greenhouse gases peaks around 2040, so if we do maybe not our best, but pretty good, we are still going to be at 18.6% of the Joshua trees left in the park. The more likely scenario, at the rate we're going, unfortunately, is by 2050, we'll be at 0.02%. So Joshua trees won't be completely extirpated from the park, and they won't go extinct, but there's going to be very, very few left. And again, there'll be Joshua trees outside the park, but the iconic, the iconic name is not going to be there anymore. All right, and I don't know anybody that doesn't like desert tortoises, but since the 90s, I think it's 90s, 90% of the desert tortoise population has been lost. In part because of lack of precipitation, and it's too hot. Also, unfortunately, they're stolen for the pet trade still. And we actually have a desert tortoise that was stolen from the wild for the pet trade up in our animal room. And then car collisions are also still a problem. And so they try really hard to get people to not hit these tortoises. But I think, unfortunately, they're hit more than we think. And again, really important species for the desert are ecosystem engineers. So they're digging these deep tunnels, and so that's aerating the soil. That's also providing habitat for other animals to survive the heat. And since it's too hot, they struggle to reproduce. Okay, so we had to change our gear completely. So we went from the desert all the way up to southeast Alaska to the temperate rainforest. And we flew into a little community called Gustavus, and during peak tourist season, I don't know, 800 people at most around. And most of the people that visit Glacier Bay National Park never touch foot on land, which isn't a bad thing. They're mostly on cruise ships. Now, the National Park Service only allows 2 cruise ships, the really big cruise ships, right, that hold thousands of people in the bay a day. And they are required to let a National Park Service interpreter ranger take a boat out to the ship, they climb aboard the cruise ship, and then they spend the day talking to the folks on the cruise ship. And so it was really interesting to get to talk to the people that do some of this work and the questions that maybe they were asked, and more information about what people believe about or understand about climate change. Now, of course, for me, going to Glacier Bay is really special because I get to take students. I'm taking another group of students this July. And in many cases, these students have never spent much time out of Kansas. They may never have seen the ocean at all. And so it's a really, really fun thing to do. Now, I've also been known to take a couple of retired professors. And I'll give a shout out to the guy in the back. This is Dan Van Leeuwen, and he puts this up for free with the students especially. And so it makes the trip very, very affordable for the students. And they get to see ecological succession in the park and all of the big wildlife. It's a much different experience for sure than living in Kansas. Okay, so we sort of had to redo what we did in Joshua Tree, except in Glacier Bay. And Joshua Tree is mostly a driving park, and there's, like I said, 3 million plus people there annually. Glacier Bay might get 500,000 people. And it's mostly a water park. So we had to, we really, really had to take a whale watching trip to interview the people on the whale watching boats. And so, it was rough to have to, watch all those whales as we're also doing the interviews. And then this is the hub of Gustavus. So we spent some time here. This is a place called the Four Corners. And off the picture, you can't see it across the street, is a gas station. And then this is it. This is where you get coffee, if you want a snack. Sometimes the restaurant is working. It's the art gallery. It's the gathering place for everyone, outside the park anyway. And then we go to the lodge, and this body of water here is called Bartlett Cove, and you can see lots of people bring their boats in for a week or so in the cove. And like I said, all the visitors have to stay at the lodge. There's very few places to stay in the park or in the area, and so usually the lodge is it, unless you want to pay a lot of money for other places. And so this is inside the lodge, and notice everybody's gathered here. That's where the Wi-Fi is. So, but it was a great opportunity to find people to interview and talk to about their experience in the park and what their thoughts on climate change were, so on and so forth. We also stopped at a place called the Viz, or the Visitor Center, and this is where most people would check in to go backcountry hiking or kayaking or whatever. And then they had a place where you could go see interpretive talks in the evening, and every night it's a different talk, and usually a different ranger. And of course, along the way, between Gustavus and the park, there's about a 12-mile stretch of road, and it maybe takes 20 minutes, but also can take a lot longer depending on who you see on the road. And so it's not uncommon to find a porcupine crossing the road, or black bear cubs following their mom around. Or if you get off and stop and walk in off a little trail, a brown bear might pop up as you're wandering around. So you have to be careful about where you're going. And probably the most worrisome, I guess you could say, if you got too close, would be a cow moose with a calf. And you don't always know they're coming, and so you have to be careful when you're driving and when you're walking around. And it wasn't too long after this picture was taken that cow moose put her ears back, and we were like, we're just going to take a step back. And then there's this place called the Cut in Bartlett Cove, close to where the lodge is. And so it's a tidal river, and at low tide, and especially if you get negative tides, it's almost a magical place to take students, and I really enjoy it myself. And they get to explore as much as they want, and you get to see all kinds of sea life from chitons, this is a type of a mollusk, brittle stars, and young sea stars. This is a sea star called a pycnopodia, and that one's relatively small, fits in your hand. But when they grow older, they can be this big and have something like, I don't know, 24 arms on them. A lot of arms, to say the least. And of course, you can find some sea anemones, and this is a type of algae, and if you squeeze it, that pops. So it's a fun thing to show people. And of course, sea urchins and clams and mussels and all kinds of things. And if you're not careful, you might actually run into a black oyster catcher. They like to hang out either there or in a little slightly different part of the cove. Now, the pinnacle of your experience at Glacier Bay typically is to go up bay. They have a big catamaran. And you start early in the morning. I want to say it's around 7 o'clock in the morning, something like that. And you're out all day till about 4:30. And so here you start at the visitor center. You go up, you stop at various locations for a few minutes to see wildlife or have the chance to see wildlife. So you go through these, hard to see, I know, but Marble Islands and all the way to a place called Glooby Knob. And 9 times out of 10, they're probably going to take you up to the Marjorie Glacier. And I only once, and I've been going there since 2014, have I had the chance to see the Johns Hopkins Glacier. And the reason they don't go there most of the time is because of seal pups, harbor seal pups. It's where they have all their babies in the summer. And so, again, as you're going up bay, you're hanging out in the boat. You have plenty of time to talk to the park ranger. You have oodles of time to look at all of the material, what we would call in the business non-personal interpretation, so the stuff that's written, not the stuff that you physically talk to somebody with. All the time in the world to do that. And again, as we're going, we're interviewing people, we're observing people, how are they interacting with the park ranger, what's the park ranger saying, all of that. And of course, you're going to find lots of interesting animals along the way, sea otters, for example. And you can actually see those lots of places. Last summer I was there, and there was a mom and a pup just hanging out by the dock where you take off to leave to go up bay. This is one stop called the Marble Islands, a big haul out for stellar sea lions. And this guy was not a part of the Marble Islands crew, but at the Gustavus dock, which is technically not in the park, this guy would hang out and try to find leftover fish scraps from people that had been fishing, and you could spend quite a while there just hanging out watching this guy. And of course, like I said, the harbor seals. And again, you can find them all up and down the bay, but there are more of them closer to the Johns Hopkins Glacier. And of course, following the seals then are the orcas. And so they're pretty transient. There's several different pods usually. And it's sort of, you don't know if you're going to see them, but if you do, they're really fun to watch. And most of the time you do get to see tufted puffins, which if you're a birder, which most of us are here, those are a really fun bird to see. You might get to see horned puffins, many other birds. Those are just some of my favorites. Another hot spot is a place called Gloomy Knob, and often you see mountain goats. I would say, I think probably every time I've been up bay, I've seen mountain goats there. Okay, now how many of you have seen a glacier? Maybe not in Alaska, but in other places, right? So it's pretty amazing if you've never seen a glacier for the first time. So this is the face of the Marjorie Glacier, and to kind of give you an indication for size, and this isn't even the whole glacier, it's about, I'd say about a mile wide, and it's about 20 stories tall above the water line, probably another 100 feet or so below the water line. And you're about, I was taking that picture probably anywhere from a quarter to a half mile away. And the boats have to stay that far away because those glaciers will calve and they can drop some pretty big chunks of ice. Another way to get a size for, or feel for scale is that bald eagle and that Berkey bit, kind of away from the glacier a bit. And I think one of the most important stories, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell the story of the Tlingit people that called Glacier Bay home, or the area around Glacier Bay home, for hundreds and hundreds of years. The Tlingit people and they have on it's from the National Park Service, their map said 1680. They had a village kind of close to where the visitor center was, and they were in a breadbasket. They had everything they needed, salmon, berries, you name it. It was a great place. Then the little ice age hits around 1750, and as the story goes, the glacier advanced as fast as a dog could trot, and it drove them out of their homeland. And eventually the glacier does recede, but by that point, the US government has control of the land, and they were not allowed back into their homeland. And so that was a pretty big point of contention for a long time. But it took about 20 years to get this building built, but it was finally finished. Well, 20 years of conversation and then, I don't know, another year or two of building. But this building was finished in 2016, which was the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service. And they had quite a celebration for the Huna Tlingit people. And this is the inside of the building. And so that screen tells the story of the glacier advancing towards the village. And then all of the pillars have different clan stories. And of course, I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention at least a little bit the story of John Muir, Scottish-born guy, and he was very interested in glaciers, and he wanted to be able to understand how glaciers carved out Yosemite Valley, for example. And along the way, in this book, it's called John Muir and the Ice That Started a Fire. And the author of that book actually lives in Gustavus. And he wrote about, in part, not only just his story, but also sort of the push and pull of the preservation versus conservation debate. So, like I said, I always make my students read this book. It's a really good book. It tells the story of John Muir, which he has his own problems, of course, but it's really interesting. His writings, his stories are really what inspired people to start to visit Alaska and want to protect that place. Okay, so then how is climate change affecting Glacier Bay? It's probably pretty easy to guess, but show you a couple of different angles here. So this is the Marjorie Glacier. That's what I showed you a little bit ago. This is another glacier, actually. It's in part the Grand Pacific, and this is the glacier that once covered the entire bay, and it's receded back over time. But you can see that it's dark, and there's been rocks fall on it, and dirt and soot and everything else. So it's sort of deflating and getting smaller and smaller. And essentially, it's getting taken over by the Ferris Glacier. So the Grand Pacific's almost done. Now, the fact that glaciers advance and recede is completely normal. However, the speed at which this is happening now is the problem. So between 1985 and 2020, 95% of Alaska's glaciers, and there's at least 100,000 of them, were thinning, stagnating, retreating, and it's all due to human-caused climate change. And again, just like with Joshua Tree, there's a list that sort of could go on and on, but humpback whales, everybody loves humpback whales. If we get a few warm summers, like that happened, I want to say 2014 to 2016, they had a major heat wave. The whale population dropped by 58% in the park. And that led to not enough production of calves. The whales were thinning, they were losing weight. And again, humpback whales are important to the ecosystem. Okay, so I'm going to kind of switch it up here and talk about why we think that climate change is sort of known as the perfect problem. And the guy that talks about this a lot, and this is a great book if you haven't had a chance to read a book, is it's called Don't Even Think About It by George Marshall. And there's several reasons why it's considered the perfect problem, but in part, it's very complex. It's actually really hard to define what the actual problem is and how you would go about solving the problem, because there's really no easy solutions to any of it. And one of the questions that was always part of our interview was, why do people get tripped up about climate change? Why is this a problem? And as a scientist, I see it pretty easy, but that doesn't always work for everybody. Okay, so one reason is psychological distance. So back in the 80s and 90s, what was sort of the poster child for climate change or global warming? Polar bear, yeah. But I live in Kansas. What does a polar bear really mean to me, right? There's a lot of distance. We don't easily make a connection between those two things. Okay, there's something called false hope and or fatalistic doubt. And so fatalistic doubt is just like, well, we're kind of screwed. We can't do anything, why bother, right? False hope is more akin to some religious entity is going to come save us at the end of the day. And really, as humans, we have a limited capacity for worry. We can't think about and worry about climate change every single minute of every single day. We're trying to go to work and raise kids and just live our lives. And also, I thought this was really interesting. As humans, this graph is not an immediate threat to us, right? Might be to some, maybe, if you're in a lucky few. But the bear is the bigger problem, right, as the immediate threat. And so, and we care more about what the immediate threat is rather than the long-term problem. Okay, who's this?
Al Gore.
Al Gore, yes. And so he was probably the best and the worst thing to happen to climate change communication, right? Depending on which end of the political spectrum you're on. Now, does anybody remember, and I distinctly remember this, I was running on a treadmill at the rec center when Senator Imhoff came on the floor with a snowball and said, "Ha ha, so much for global warming." Okay? And this political divide has gotten we're really far apart right now, but it didn't actually used to be that way. Back in the 90s or late 80s, we were actually pretty evenly split. Republicans and Democrats both thought that climate change or global warming was going to be a problem and that we needed to address it. So what changed? Guesses? So many things. So politics was huge. Politics is very big. The biggest, by far, indicator of whether or not you accept anthropogenic or human-caused climate change is your political party, by far. And this, of course, it's not true for every single person. But we had one party who was heavily involved with the oil industry, and the oil industry hired not just sort of the same people, but the exact same people that tried to sow seeds of doubt in us thinking, trying to convince us that smoking wasn't bad for us. So it was the same folks that talked about tried to lie to us about the tobacco industry. And then they also came up with some pretty clever campaigns. Does anybody remember hearing about your carbon footprint? Probably still hear about it today, some, yeah. And it was really clever on their part because they put the blame on the consumer and not on big oil companies themselves. And so it was a way for us to basically make us feel really crappy about everything that we did or didn't do, and we were never going to be able to do enough. And really it does. I mean, individual actions do matter, of course, but it's the big oil industry that's really the problem here. And of course, and you throw media and every media outlet under the sun, and you get a really perfect storm here. And ultimately, this guy by the name of Andrew Hoffman, that's another interesting book to read if you have the chance, says we're the product of our surroundings. We gravitate towards opinions that fit with those of the people with whom we identify. So we like to be in our own separate groups, right? Now, this is a big chart. I'm gonna leave it up here for a minute. And this is about who do you trust to learn about climate change? Okay, so this is all registered voters, and they polled registered voters. This was 2022. It came from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, as well as George Mason University's Center for Climate Change Communication. And again, look at your political party and see who you trust the most. But still, at the top, for everybody, is family and friends. Okay, so keep that in your mind. Okay, and this is online. You can go find this and much more information to take a look at. But in terms of this particular poll did not include the National Park Service, but Pew did a research project where they did include the National Park Service, and the National Park Service was the most trusted agency. So hearing from National Park Rangers is really important. All right, so then we have another piece of the puzzle here. This is, again, Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. This is the 6 Americas study. So you can go online and you can take a little quiz, and it fits you into one of these categories, kind of on a sliding scale. Okay, and it turns out there are a lot more people worried about or alarmed about climate change than there are that are not. And especially back in the 90s and early 2000s, climate change or global warming was a really hot topic. People didn't want to talk about it. But that has certainly started to shift. So this was between 2014 and 2024. A lot more people started becoming alarmed about climate change. So again, the tide is sort of shifting. So continuing on with, I tried to just take some screenshots of some of this information here, but I just wanted to point out a few things. So beliefs, and I sort of take issue with beliefs because you accept or you don't accept climate change, but that's neither here nor there. So, and they asked people, is global warming happening? 72% of the country says yes. Global warming is caused mostly by human activities. Not even quite 60%. And then most scientists think global warming is happening, only 57%. And that's pretty alarming as somebody that works in the science department, right? All of this sort of is. Now, you can actually go on and you can put in like your state and even your county and see what people believe in this tool. A couple other things to point out here. So, are you worried about global warming? 63% say they are. Global warming is already harming people in the United States. About 58% say yes. Going on to this one, global warming will harm future generations. So most people think it's going to harm future generations, okay? And then down here, global warming will harm me personally, not even 50%, okay? So distant future, psychological distance, not going to happen to me. And here's some interesting behaviors. Do you discuss global warming, at least occasionally? 36% of people. That's it. We don't talk about it, still. We might worry about it, but we don't talk about it. And then, do you hear about it in the media? And 28%, not even a third of people hear about it in the media. So we've got some work to do here. So I try to say, okay, what does all of this tell us? What is all of the research that my team and I did? What do all the books say? What do all the journal articles say? What does all of this say? So, kind of in a nutshell, not everybody understands or accepts that anthropogenic or human-caused climate change is happening, or that there's even a scientific consensus. And we kind of know why, right? Because there are folks that plant seeds of doubt in people's minds. Now, they might not question the scientists, but they will question the scientists. And that becomes really problematic. Do you guys remember something called ClimateGate? Anybody remember hearing about that a little bit? So basically, some emails for some climate scientists were stolen, and they had some of their jargon within the emails. And certain groups got a hold of it and said, see, they're lying to you. But they were just using their own jargon. But people didn't understand that, and so That was a big story at the time. All right, so for many people, climate change seems to be a problem in the distant future, like I said, or it's not going to hurt them personally. And most of us don't hear about it or talk about it regularly. So what is the antidote for that? So I was saying earlier to Steve and Cindy when we were at dinner, I said, I get really annoyed when people give these presentations and they just say, well, more research is needed. So I don't want to do that. So the antidote to this, I think, is stories, and especially personal stories. If you can say you've been in a place and you tell people what you experienced, they can't really argue with your story. Relevant to place, because place really does matter, and sometimes even at the most appropriate moment. Those are all critical, and especially if you can bring them together. And the National Park Service, because they are such highly trusted messengers, and again, you have to trust the messenger before you're going to accept whatever it is that they're telling you. They really do have a golden opportunity to help educate the public using, remember, the best science available, and hopefully inspire some constructive hope in people, or also active hope. And this is the idea. We have to remain hopeful, but we also have to do something. So we had lots of recommendations for our partners, but I'm just going to mention a few here. So, and they seem kind of obvious, but not obvious to the folks that were there for some odd reason. So in Glacier Bay, for example, that building was built in, I don't know, the 60s, something like that. And again, Glacier Bay, perfect place to talk about climate change. There were 0 signs or exhibits or talks about climate change when we were there. 0. And in our interviews, people were going, yeah, that's kind of weird. Why aren't they talking about it? Okay, and in Joshua Tree, they did have exhibits, and their problem really, and there wasn't much they could do about some of it, they just didn't have the space. But also, when we were there, and we didn't tell them necessarily what we were doing all the time, but they had this great, really good exhibit on climate change. The park ranger had put a table in front of it and sat there, and so you couldn't see it. Okay, so interestingly enough, both parks have pretty decent online or media presence when it comes to climate change and educating folks about climate change. If you follow Joshua Tree's Facebook feed, they have lots of great content. They have a great podcast called Where Two Deserts Meet, where they get to talk about this stuff. Glacier Bay doesn't do as great a job of that, and I don't want to disparage, the point is not disparaging the parks for not doing their jobs. They just may not have the staff, or they may not have the leadership to do some of this. And when we were doing these interviews and talking to our partners, they started telling us all of these really cool stories, and I'm like, why isn't this in the program? One guy was talking about how he would get a permit to hunt moose, and the season to hunt moose, and the temperatures are now a little bit off kilter. So when you would go hunt the moose, you would take the meat and just store it in the snow. It's too warm to do that now, and so in some places. And so that was a really interesting story, I thought, that would probably resonate with some folks that like to visit Glacier Bay, for example. And a lot of this does come down to leadership. So park superintendents, for example, they have to be willing to sort of put their necks out there and allow their interpreters to put their necks out there to tell the stories, to use the proper science. And in addition to that, these park rangers have to know how to find common ground and understand that climate change isn't the hot topic that it once was. If you kind of go back and remember the dismissive group in that chart I showed you a little bit ago, it's only about 10 or 11% of people that sort of fall into this category that you will never convince in any way, shape, or form. But 90% or so of the population you can have a conversation with. You may not get the outcome you want, but having the conversation is important. And so overall, what can I do? What can an individual person do? People always ask that. So, some of it's fairly obvious. Volunteer your time and money and talent to build community and support organizations. And that leads to that active or constructive hope, where we feel like we're part of a social group, we're doing something. And this particular picture, this was a volunteer organization, and we're trying to plant more Joshua trees. Something that I didn't initially think of right away was ask media outlets to do more stories about climate change. So you can actually write to your media station, whichever one you watch, and say, hey, I want to see more stories about this. And I have redundancy up there because the more we hear about it, the more we're going to accept it, right? Of course, I have to say vote at the ballot box, but also vote with your wallet. And I always tell people to encourage people to contact your representatives. Seems like it doesn't do a lot of good, but in fact, it does do some good. Otherwise, they're not going to know anyway. And the last thing I'll say is the research all says, and Catherine Hayhoe, who's a well-known climate scientist and science communicator, to talk about it. The number one thing that you can do to help combat climate change is to talk about it. So that's what I did tonight. And many thanks. I will put up my research team here, Pamela Blair-Bruce, Heather Waterman, and Amanda Berlinski. All of us were from different parts of the country, and we did all this work together. And many thanks, of course, to our research participants and our advisor, Teresa Coble. And with that, I will be happy to take questions. Turn the projection. Light controls. I don't know how to get back to the light controls. All lights on. Okay. Megan.
Did you have a lot of people who were tourists who you said, can we interview you about climate change? And they said no.
Yeah. Not as many as you would think. And actually what was really interesting is you kind of get an idea of like what people might say, and you're like, oh, is this really going to track with what other researchers do? And you know what? And it did track pretty well. We got, most of the people did accept climate change as a reality, or if they did, the ones that were a little bit questionable didn't think it was human caused. So it was really interesting to hear people's answers, for sure. But yeah, we got lots of, no thanks. But I will say, actually, this one interview was super interesting. So I caught this guy coming up the dock in Glacier Bay. He was an older gentleman, kind of dressed in flannel. And he didn't think that climate change was human caused. And he expected us to argue with him. And we just asked him the questions and said, thank you very much. And we went our separate ways. And about 5 minutes later, that guy turned around and came back to talk to us and say, you know, I don't believe in polluting the environment. You know, that river that caught fire, that wasn't good. And, you know, he went on and on. And so we treated him with respect, and he was willing to come back and talk to us even more. It was a really interesting thing.
I just want to share a quick thing where we really saw climate change. It will be with me forever. But about, it was in 22, we took a sailboat and traveled in the Great Bear Rainforest, which is south and a bit east of where you were at Glacier Bay. And we were back in there for probably a week. But, and we were both on water and on land. Well, I didn't know a river could die. And we were there in October. We thought we'd be cold. We thought we might have rain. It was a very dry trip in October in British Columbia. So we went on land, and of course the salmon were supposed to be running late. But they should have been running, and they go back to their homeland to have more. Well, these salmon, we got out and we were walking upriver with a guide, and the salmon were trying so hard But as they got further in, the water was a trickle. And they were competitive because their sense was that they should keep going. And they were dying. I mean, we walked along the river, we saw dying salmon.
Yeah.
And it was because it had been hot and no rain. And later, we heard that the river was declared dead and they had lost 10,000 salmon.
Yeah. Yeah. And salmon, as you know, are quite important to both marine and a forest ecosystem. Yeah.
But you know, you can tell stories and listen, but when you see it with your own eyes, I mean,
Yeah, it's certainly
it
heart-wrenching.
together.
Yeah. Yeah.
It just seems like, you mentioned leadership in the Park Service and all that. But you know, visiting a lot of parks and talking to some of the rangers, they're under so much stress.
Yes.
They're taking signs down.
Absolutely.
They're taking climate signs down.
Yep.
How in the hell do we support the National Park Service beyond just getting rid of this current administration? I mean, how can you support these poor people?
Right. So I think that you can support them, not necessarily, I mean, you can always, write your congressman, all the things I said, but you can also donate to like the National Park Foundation and the sort of the Friends of organizations that will support park rangers and their work in other ways. And I will tell you, yes, from firsthand experience, there were park rangers in my cohort, and it does get very wearing on them. And we certainly had some nights that were not fun because they were highly affected by the parks. Not necessarily just climate change, but like you said, they're losing signs about slavery and everything else that you can think of that this administration may not agree with. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna. Oh, one more.
Out of all,
Thanks. Sorry. It's the thing.
so for 2 weeks you interviewed park visitors.
Park visitors, park rangers, stakeholders, everybody that we could get our hands on.
Out of all of those interviews, what was it that surprised you the most? Or that
The thing that surprised me the most, I think, was especially like the park biologists and the people that didn't actually do the interpretation. They had all this information and it wasn't getting translated to the interpreters so the interpreters could share that information. And so there needed to be better communication, and there is a ton of trainings that people can take about how to communicate climate change and that sort of thing. And unless the superintendents give the park rangers time, they'll never get the training. And especially down in Glacier Bay, it's not as big of an issue because you have to have some experience before you get to interpret at the park, at that park. But like at Joshua Tree, you might get somebody that's 22 years old. They might know this much about climate change and are terrified that some big dude is going to walk up to them and start yelling in their face. And they don't know how to handle that. And so leadership really does matter in this situation.
this is huge.
Yeah.
Since the research shows that the park rangers are some of the most trusted
Yes.
sources.
Yes. So it's a big job for the park rangers, but many of them can do it. They just need the training to do it. They need to be given the permission to do it sometimes because there are situations where, and this happened in Glacier Bay, where a senator will come to the park and they don't like what an interpreter says, and then they complain, and that superintendent gets in trouble, and therefore the interpreter also gets in trouble. And so you have to have a superintendent that's got a backbone, that's willing to say, nope, this is the science, this is what we're doing.
Are you encouraged that the work you're doing is going to have an effect?
Yeah, I hope it does, and I think it has already. Now, if you know anything about the Park Service, trying to get a new exhibit, put up somewhere will literally take years. You can do like movable signs and things like that. And one of the things it was a little thing, but it was something. I was in Glacier Bay this summer, and right outside the interpretive area, they did put a sign about climate change right outside. I mean, it was just a little one, but it was something. right? And so sometimes you just have to start with something.
Maybe you can get the table moved out of the way.
Yes. Yeah.
Did you get the feeling that, especially at Glacier Bay, that you were kind of, should say preaching to the choir because you were asking questions, but most of the people that were there were sympathetic to that issue more than the general populace would be?
Not necessarily. So there were some people, of course, that, yeah, we were preaching to the choir. But there are also certain situations where, you know, I think people start to see changes, like this one group where they've been fishing a lot, and they said, you know, we don't see these fish anymore, you know, but they weren't necessarily willing to make the connection, and so you get all sorts of people at all these parks. But yes, in general, more people, you know, you felt like you were preaching to the choir in Glacier Bay.
You mentioned stakeholders, what does that mean?
So stakeholders, so like the guy that takes us out on whale watching is not in the park, but I would consider him a stakeholder because people that do visit the park almost always take a whale watching tour. Or, you know, park associations, for example, something like that. So I would consider them stakeholders. Some of the subject matter experts we interviewed were like retired park rangers, like I said, yeah, and then the visitors and then the park staff themselves. And like I said, they weren't all interpretive rangers. Some of them were park biologists. Some of them worked with, I mean, at one point did do park biology, but then some of them also, like one person in particular was responsible for the contracts at this point in her career with like the concessionaires that work with the park. So it's quite an interesting mix of people. Yeah, so. All right, well, like I said, I'll stick around if you have any other questions, but have a good rest of your evening.